Welcome to Module 5, Qualitative Methodologies. Before I get into the content of this video in terms of the actual readings that you're going to be doing and so on, I'd like to turn to what's coming up so that you have that information and can be planning for it. In this module, you'll be looking at chapters 7 and 8 of Creswell. And in those chapters, Creswell talks about collecting in chapter 7, and then in chapter 8, analyzing and interpreting qualitative data. He does a wonderful job of outlining the various aspects of actually doing the work with the data and also collecting the data. Patent I'll talk about in a moment when I go into the content for his paper. The Creswell chapters I'm not going to be looking at in this video. As I said, they're self-evident, and if you have any questions at all, please feel free to get in touch with me about it. However, I think that it's the kind of information that you can kind of take some time to go through and underline and do all of those things that are going to be helpful to you to go back to when you're actually doing your research, because it's very practical, kind of hands-on information. Patent offers a more philosophical look at the whole discussion around the methodologies, qualitative methodologies. In terms of your assignments, you'll be doing Forum 4 for Module 5, and you'll also be handing in, or you'll be preparing your second set of articles where you'll choose 7 papers and you'll do an annotated bibliography for those 7 papers, as you did for the first part of this assignment. Pardon me, and then you're going to synthesize the key ideas across all those 7 papers. And I'm going to be talking about that more specifically in a moment, but I emphasize the word synthesize here because this is a very particular kind of skill. And it's the kind of skill that you'll be using for your literature review, so I want to talk about that in greater detail in a moment. And then last, coming up, is going to be your research approach assignment in Module 6. I'm not going to talk about it at this point. I will be preparing a video about it that you'll be able to see before the end of Module 5. However, what you need to be thinking about ahead of time is what chapter you wish to choose. Okay. All right. Some of the other things that are available on Module 5 are, of course, the video that you're currently watching. There's also a video about doing an effective interview in qualitative research. It isn't really something that's required, but for many of you, this is something that is of interest, and perhaps you have a lot of questions around it. And this just is kind of a fun way of looking at some of the things that happen in interviews and some of the things you need to be thinking about. So I just leave it there as a resource for you. And of course the forum. None of these things have been opened up yet on my page, so that's why they're looking a little bit lighter than usual. Last in Module 5 is a paper called An Approach to Writing a Synthesis. And when you open that link, you're going to find a discussion, really a kind of a how-to of writing a synthesis. The topic that they're using as an example has nothing to do with educational leadership. It has nothing to do with kinds of things we've been talking about or you've been talking about during your program. But nevertheless, it offers an example of how it is that people approach writing a synthesis and some of the actual nitty-gritty skills that help organize information. The key point that they make is that a synthesis is not simply a laundry list of what various authors have said, but it's an exploration, a comparison and contrasting of some of the information that authors have said across all of the articles. So I'll leave that to you to have a look at, and if you have any further questions about it, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about that. Lastly, in Module 6, I've left things still unopened. However, there is one section here. And this shouldn't be open either, but I'll close that in a moment. Choosing a chapter for concept map assignment. there is an assignment that I'll be talking about in greater detail by the end of Module 5, and probably even sooner than that, so that you have a chance to kind of start preparing for it. But what you need to do ahead of time is choose the chapter from Creswell in the last section of the book that you're going to be using as your chapter for the concept map assignment. So in order to do that, you'll need to open that link, and you will notice that there's a whole list of the various designs, action research, mixed methods, narrative, ethnographic, grounded theory design, survey design, and correlational design. And then what you will do then is you will be able to select one of those choices. Because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and there's 17 of you, then of course that means that there's going to be some repetition, but I will be limiting the amount of repetition that's possible so that we have a representation across all of these methodologies. And the idea is not necessarily that you'll pick one that you'll be using. Many of you will not be using any of these, actually. You may be using something quite different, but these are the major approaches in certain kinds of certain kinds of methodologies that are used quite often in research, and it's an important body of knowledge for you to have. So this offers you an opportunity to become very familiar with one of those approaches, and then do a presentation online of that approach, and also a follow-up short paper about it. And then that will be presented on the forum so that everyone has an opportunity to have a look at the ways in which you have presented this information, and can even save that information if they wish to, if it's something that they think they might use for their own research project, or it's just something of interest to them and they would like to keep that information for further use later on. So, so you'll simply just, in that little circle, if you can barely see it, you just click your choice, and then you'll be able to, that will be the approach that you'll be looking at for this assignment. So I hope that's clear. If you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, let's go on and have a look at the Patton article and see what he has to tell us about qualitative methodologies. In this module, we're going to be looking at 2 chapters from Creswell, and we're also going to be looking at a reading by Michael Quinn Patton, who was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but he now does program evaluation full-time in the health sciences. In Creswell's chapter, he explores specifically the hows of qualitative research. In chapter 7, he looks particularly at how to organize your research study, how to collect data, how to organize that data, etc. And in chapter 8, he talks in great detail and in very clear detail about how to analyze and interpret qualitative data, how you do thematic analysis, etc. He talks about various ways that you can do that. He's a fan of the more technological approaches. There are, of course, other approaches as well that don't require special programs, and most of you will not be using that kind of program. They tend to be very expensive, so unless you have access to them, they are less likely to be something that you will use. However, it's still good to read through and find out more about how people actually approach this task, because it can be a complex one. Patton, on the other hand, explores a more philosophical issue. And I think this probably comes out of his experience as a qualitative researcher within a field that privileges quantitative analysis. And he looks at the range of qualitative approaches to research, and there are many, and he names many of them at the beginning of the chapter. And of course, there are more than that as well, but he gives you an idea of the kinds of ranges that there are under this umbrella we could call qualitative research. And he looks in particular at issues of quality and credibility in relation to the audience that's accepting the research, and the intended purpose of the research, which all of which is very important. So in terms of credibility, by the way, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Creswell because as Creswell does so well, his work is, I won't say self-evident because it's not that it's easy, it's certainly rigorous, but it is complete and it is very accessible. So it just requires time to go through it and to pay attention to what he's talking about. But I'm not going to pay attention a lot to it in this video, but if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to talk more with you about it. However, I just don't think it's worth spending a whole lot of extra time on it in this video. And much of what Patton talks about, Creswell talks about to some degree as well, from a different perspective. All right, so let's look at this whole notion of credibility, because this is what Patton spends a great deal of time on. At its core, Patton argues, qualitative analysis is a creative process because it depends on the insights and conceptual abilities of the researcher. Now, this can make people nervous, especially those who are from fields of study that are used to predictable methods of quantitative analysis. However, he argues that qualitative analysis is equally methodical, analytically rigorous. You do things like explore alternative explanations, for example, and it's transparent because unlike quantitative analysis, which usually doesn't name the position of the researcher, in qualitative analysis, the positionality of the researcher is key to the methodology and the methods that are used. Confirmation of the reliability of the research can be achieved through triangulation, not to confirm the analysis, but to enrich it. And this can take the form of having a variety of participants, using various kinds of data, and so on. So for example, when I was doing my doctoral research, and I'll try to do this briefly, you know how we researchers are, we get talking about our research and can't stop, so I'll do it very briefly. In my doctoral research, I was looking at the phenomenon of resistance to gender equity policy. So it was the phenomenon of resistance that I was interested in. However, from my perspective, it was also interesting to look at what was the data that existed that prompted gender equity policy. So quantitative data was important to my analysis, as was qualitative. I used a methodology called hermeneutic phenomenology, and I also used critical theory as well to inform my analysis. In some ways they're incommensurable, but I was able to argue for their commensurability in this context. I also explored this question through the perspective of those who had experienced resistance to gender equity policy, that is, the gender equity officers that were in place in the various boards of education in Ontario, who were charged with implementing this process of moving towards gender equity and meeting the targets that had been set. From their perspective, of course, various kinds of things happened. And they experienced some resistance, and so I wanted to understand it. So I interviewed those who were expressing resistance. Sometimes those were senior people in the organization. Sometimes those were principals in schools, etc. So when they identified people who might help me to flesh out my understanding of this particular phenomenon, then I went and I interviewed them as well. And so I built, and I also did document analysis as well. So I had various ways in which I approached this question. It wasn't that each form of data collection, data production, confirmed my analysis so much as it enriched my analysis, and that's the point that he makes. So triangulation is one of the ways to enhance credibility because it's a very deep kind of an analysis rather than the broad kind of analysis that's done in quantitative research. In addition to credibility that comes out of rigorous techniques and methods, there's also the credibility of the researcher. And there's various ways in which researchers can provide some kind of proof of their own credibility. That can come through training, the kind of training that you're engaged in right now and that you'll be engaged in over the next couple of courses that you'll be taking. It can come from experience. So your observation assignment earlier in the course was a way to have that experience of observation, but also to ask questions of that experience. So why was this successful or not successful? What were the things that would make observation more successful? So at this point, you can do a better job of answering that question because you've had that experience. To enhance that experience, it might be worth going back and observing with a particular question in mind and seeing what that's like as well. But you now know that observation is a very intense kind of an experience. It's not simply sitting at Tim Hortons, which is some of the locations that some of you chose, or at a swim meet or whatever, the way you would on a regular Saturday morning, for example. Track record can be one of the ways in which a researcher can establish credibility, and so on. So there are various ways in which that can happen, and Patton talks about that as being important in establishing credibility of the research. Preparation and training for doing the research being probably the most important. The philosophical belief in the value of qualitative inquiry can't be understated as well. As I've mentioned, I've had some students in sciences and maths, for example, who are doing qualitative analysis or qualitative research for their PhD project, for example. And it takes a period of time for them to become comfortable with the philosophical ideas undergirding qualitative inquiry, as well as the methods and methodologies, and trusting those methods and methodologies, and using the language of qualitative inquiry. So we can't say qualitative inquiry is generalizable, for example, because it's a particular case. So it's particular rather than generalizable. We can't say that it's transferable to another location because it's very contextually bound. So there are ways in which qualitative inquiry is very different than quantitative inquiry. So if you use the same language, you're undercutting the case that you're building. But it does other kinds of things. So, Patton then argues that we need to move beyond the numbers game, which is indicated by the bias that sometimes exists against qualitative research, where it's seen as soft data, where we don't succumb to the seductiveness of numbers. That's particularly prevalent in neoliberal democracies, in education, where accountability measures measured by numbers are the predominant way in which we understand and give credence to the educational processes that teachers and students are engaged in. That perhaps there are other ways to understand the process of education that are equally valid, that give us different kinds of information that are equally helpful. That we need to be for what he calls pro-meaningfulness, not anti-numbers. So it's not that we're against numbers when we're arguing that we want to do qualitative research. It's that we're after meaning, not the kind of measures that come out of quantitative analysis. And we need to get over our fear of subjectivity. That subjective understanding has value as well. It's not the same as opinion. It is not simply coming out of life experience, but it's coming out of a rigorous engagement with the phenomenon, a rigorous body of knowledge that others have come to as well in various ways, including quantitative analysis, and then doing our analysis based on our subjective understanding of it. So in this battle between qualitative and, I wanted to say one more thing back here. Let me see. One of the things I wanted to mention here, and this goes to the points I make in the next two slides,
Patton talks about the researcher, you, as being the actual instrument of the inquiry. That is, um, you're the instrument through which the research is actually passes, and the analysis comes out of your understanding of the phenomena that you're exploring. So just as a quantitative researcher needs to justify the particular instrument they have used for their theory, or for their survey rather, for example, the qualitative researcher needs to address their credibility through preparation, through training, and all of the things that we've talked about. So I found that a really interesting point, to think of yourself as the instrument. And so in doing that, then of course it becomes important that you establish your credibility, and you move beyond the numbers game, and you move towards instead being familiar with the arguments that people use in justifying qualitative research and its efficacy. So part of that is, as Lincoln and Guba talk about in much more philosophical terms, quantitative and qualitative methods are different. They are not better, they are not worse, they are not the same as each other, they are different, but they're not better or worse than one another. They simply respond to different kinds of phenomena and help us to engage with those phenomena in a meaningful way, but in different ways. The debate has been strident, he puts forward, but it has softened. Certainly when I first started doing my master's research, I had to justify in a very significant degree why I was choosing qualitative research. I had to have every single duck in a row and be able to argue for every single duck that was in that row, unlike those of my colleagues who were doing quantitative analysis. Things have changed since then. The paradigmatic shift has occurred, and now there is a kind of established protocol. It's a very complex protocol, and there are a wide-ranging number of approaches that qualitative researchers use. But nevertheless, there's a body of knowledge around it now that makes it paradigmatically acceptable. So a consensus has gradually emerged, Patton argues, that the important challenge is to match appropriately the methods to empirical questions and issues. What's the empirical phenomena that you are trying to understand? What's the empirical issue that you're trying to understand? And having named it and located it, then you choose your methodology. So, and not to universally advocate any single methodological approach to all problems, but to be open to those approaches that are going to best respond to the phenomena that you are exploring. Now, there's some practical issues that are attached to doing qualitative research that Creswell gets into as well. And that is some issues like the time and money involved. So you're not going to probably want to compare principles practices in Alberta as compared to principles practices in Iqaluit, because of the time that's required for travel and because of the money that's required for travel. Now, you might want to do that technologically in some way, but to actually go and interview a principal face-to-face is going to require probably more resources than any of us wish to expend at this point. So it's important then for your research design to be practical in terms of the time and money required. Time will be the one that will be most important for you, because the cohort-based program has a particular timeline, and so you need to be aware of that and keep that in mind for as you design your research. Your equipment, this is one that people don't often talk a lot about, but it can sure get you in trouble. I was using video for the first time for some research and had traveled to Kingston, Ontario. My colleague and I that were doing this big research project were traveling from Ontario over to PEI and back again. and interviewing people all along the way. So we had some research funds, significant research funds to do this research, but I was using video for the first time. And I was not aware that you had to do something to that little memory card. So I videotaped the person that I wished to interview using my lovely new video camera, put in the memory card, but of course it did absolutely nothing because it wasn't, I hadn't done anything with it to set it up. And so I lost that interview, and it couldn't be replicated. I couldn't redo it. I had to get back to Toronto to get to the airport to join my colleague on our trip out to the East Coast. And so that interview was mostly lost, other than the notes that I took immediately after. And so, doing a trial run to make sure that you know the equipment, especially if it's new to you, is important. You might want to have duplicates as well. So for example, if you're using some kind of digital recorder, you might want to have a tape recorder as well, just as a backup in case the digital recorder ends for some reason, or and you'll have a tape backup. It's not necessary, but it gives you a little extra confidence, I think, if nothing else. You want to do a trial run too to test your questions, to be sure that they actually elicit the kind of information that you're wanting. So you might have a friend who is in a similar position to the person that you're wanting to interview, or the people that you're wanting to interview. So you might ask them if they'll be willing to sit down for a few minutes, and you won't use it as part of your data set, but you'll just ask the questions and see what it's like to interview a person in that position, and to see whether your questions elicit the kinds of responses that you're looking for, rather than no, yes, but that are fulsome and give you the kind of information you need. You will want to check your timing too, because if you've asked a very busy person to set aside an hour for an interview, and you find that your questions actually take about an hour and a half, then that could be a problem. So it's good to do a trial run, and it gives you a kind of comfort zone as well in terms of your own interviewing skills. And we'll talk about that further on in the course. You'll want to set up a quiet, comfortable, preferably unhurried setting for interviews. And I'm saying this from experience, because if you're interviewing, I've done a lot of interviews of principals and directors and superintendents of education and so on. And when you do that, you're working, if you interview them in their own office, which is probably the most convenient for them, it's also the hub of all the potential interruptions that can occur. So if it's possible to change the timing so that that's less likely to occur, or to meet them in a restaurant somewhere, a quiet restaurant if you can find such a thing, or some other location in the building that's where they aren't going to be interrupted, that would be far more preferable. But you also have to be prepared for changes on the fly. So you've set up that room, but then somebody has to do some kind of an exam, and that's the only place where they can do it. Or the person is called out on an emergency and you can't meet with them that day. Or, there are 101 things that can happen. So just be prepared for that. Doesn't mean that you don't want to talk to you. It means that life happens. And so be prepared for changes on the fly. So you might have to change your timing. You might have to set up another time with them because of your own schedule. When it happens, don't let it rattle you. It's just a part of life. But when you do have a chance to sit down, take a deep breath and enjoy the process. Interviewing to me is one of the most enjoyable parts of doing research, because people are so open and usually very honest, unmercifully honest sometimes in their responses. And that's a real privilege as a researcher, to have someone trust you to the extent that they will be that open with you. So enjoy that process. It's one of the few times in our lives when we have a chance to set aside time to talk about a topic that we're very, very interested in with somebody who has an equal interest in that same topic. And so enjoy that period of time together, benefit from it, use it wisely, whatever information you gain, and enjoy the process as you're engaged in it. So I hope this information has been helpful to you. As you go through the readings, if you have any particular questions about any of the ideas that the authors put forward, I'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. further. I like to keep these videos at a reasonable length of time, so I don't want to get into absolutely every little thing, but maybe something comes up and you're just wondering about it. Please feel free to get in touch with me about it, and I'd be glad to engage with you on it. So enjoy this unit. Enjoy the fact that you're close to completing this very important course in this process of you becoming a researcher. And I hope that this unit is particularly helpful in that process. Take care.